Hello, this is George from George's Music Blog, and today I am talking about the Lost EP by Squarepusher, Stereotype. Now, I'm taking a slightly different approach to this video. It's a bit less rehearsed than it would normally be because I haven't had time, and this release is dropping, I think, today, so I wanted to get this video out here. So I've got a few notes down here which I will be looking at from time to time, so please just bear with me on that. Now, just to clarify things, Stereotype is technically an EP, and although it came out under the artist name Stereotype and the release was called Stereotype, it is in fact the work of a certain Tom Jenkinson, better known by his longtime alias Squarepusher. It originally came out in 1994 on the experimental drum and bass imprint Spymania, well, on a sub-label of Spymania, who also released various of Squarepusher's very early EPs, as well as the Burning an Entry compilation. Can never say that one. It has now been remastered and reissued by Warp Records, the label who have released the vast majority of Squarepusher's albums and who he has been with since around 1997. So they're the ones who are calling it the Lost EP. I'm sure it wasn't considered lost by any of the lucky few who bought an original copy back in the day, or anyone who's listened to it on YouTube in the last few decades. But you can't blame a record label for trying to generate some hype. Warp also repackaged Squarepusher's debut, Feed Me Weird Things, for the 25th anniversary edition a couple of years ago. At the time, I know Tom said he wasn't particularly interested in revisiting old material from his back catalogue, but since then Ultra Visitor has also been remastered and re-released, so maybe something's changed his mind. Either way, it means more Squarepusher music out there in the world, in a sense, which is only a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Maybe Warp have bought up the rights to his entire back catalogue and are going to trickle out some more of these oldies, in which case maybe we can expect a re-release of the Buzz Kaner album that he recorded as Chaos AD. Who knows? Anyway, let's get into this Stereotype EP. Now, despite the fact that I am a devotee of Squarepusher's music, check out the description below for more of my videos on his discography. I had never listened to Stereotype until a couple of weeks ago. I'm perhaps not as much of a hardcore completist as some die-hard fans out there, and much like Jenkinson himself, I guess I would be much more interested in brand new Squarepusher material rather than very old Squarepusher material. But since I'd embarked on this discography review and seeing the trailer for this release, it seemed to make perfect sense to check it out. This is by no means going to be a critical review. I can't imagine for a moment that a 19-year-old Tom Jenkinson recording these tracks back in the early 90s thought for a minute that they would be picked over 30 years later by someone who cared enough to make a video about it. So yeah, let's just take them as they are. The earliest experiments of a fledgling artist finding their voice and still figuring out how to use the tools available to them to capture their ideas. What is striking straight away is how instantly recognizable they are as Squarepusher. Despite the fact he only possessed rudimentary gear at this point, the tone and character of the melodies in particular is there to see, or there to hear. Sure, the production and composition is pretty rough around the edges, but it's clear even at this early stage, Jenkinson had a sense for crafting a unique and distinctive sound that was very much his own. And that is probably one of the hardest things, maybe for any musician, but especially for a kind of bedroom electronic producer. Now, excuse me while I have some coffee. There are also significant differences between the music on Stereotype and the Squarepusher we know and love. Each of the 6 tracks is essentially an extended jam, which were clearly laid down live, probably with several elements recorded in one take. There's a few tracks on Feed Me Weird Things that were recorded in this way before he got hold of a 4-track recorder, so I'm pretty safe bet to say that all of Stereotype was recorded in that manner. This gives it a distinctly free-form improvisational feel. There is heavy use of the Roland SH-101 synth, described by Tom elsewhere as a mainstay of acid house. He uses that to create some excellent melodies and riffs, which he then tweaks and modulates and layers up over the course of several minutes. So as well as having that slightly acidic rave sound, it almost gives it a kind of psychedelic, proggy sort of feel. So let's get into the details. Whooshki is undeniably the main draw of Stereotype, and if a single track is going to motivate anyone to purchase the release, then I would say it would be this one. It's a 16-minute jam, heavily dominated by the SH-101, as I understand. Recognisable for featuring on many other Squarepusher tracks, and one in particular that sticks out is Theme from Ernest Borgnine. Like that one, Wooshki has a very sunny, joyous kind of energy as Tom crafts kind of what is a fairly straightforward refrain and then tweaks and modulates it over the course of several minutes, accompanied by a bass pattern underneath and a raw but robust beat. Almost jungle, but not quite, with the swing of jungle, more of a sort of liquid feeling, just sort of hovering below that kind of like 160, 170 BPM mark. As I said, right at this embryonic stage in his development, his ear for melody and mood shines through. You can tell in the first few bars straight away that this is a Tom Jenkinson melody. I've talked at length in other videos about how his melodies evoke to me that sense of suburbia with a heavy kind of nostalgic slant. But another way of characterizing that could be urban psychedelic. What do I mean by that? This is going to be a little short digression. Now, whereas traditionally the notion of something being psychedelic has implications, I would say, of nature, the natural world, maybe a kind of pre-technological era, being closely bound up with the fantasy worlds of Tolkien and Middle-earth, the psychedelic aesthetic often featuring wizards, mythical beasts, and similar tropes, a sense of otherworldliness that draws from a very, very traditional notions of how reality can be subverted through magic, sorcery, or kind of becoming one with nature. And I think much of that is in keeping with the aesthetic of lots of prog rock bands who were considered psychedelic back in the 60s and 70s. Then there was the advent of digital technology and forms of music that are programmed rather than played, and of course genres such as techno that very much look to the future and to machines for inspiration. But many artists working in this form were still creating what could be considered psychedelic music, in the sense that it takes you out of normal experience and subverts everyday notions of reality, but very much in the context of technology, machines, and virtual worlds. And there's something in that sound, for example, the use of the SH-101, but also the general sound of progressive electronic music in the early 90s, what would go on to be called intelligent dance music, but wasn't called that at the time, I don't think, at that point. Acts like B12, early Black Dog, Future Sound of London, Aphex Twin, obviously. All of those artists have a very urban sound, drawing heavily from urban genres like techno and house, with the mechanical beats and the futuristic stance. But they are also richly psychedelic in their suggestion of otherworldliness. And that is very much the sense I get from the music on Stereotype. Don't know if you know what I'm on about. Anyway, that's the end of that little digression. Back to Wooshki. I don't know if it was a specific influence, but it also reminds me of the track Res by Underworld in its overall vibe, and the fact that it is essentially composed of this kind of never-ending synth line that just rises and rises on this joyful, freewheeling energy and a high-tempo beat. Res has higher euphoria levels, but both tracks have that kind of sunrise energy about them, whether that's, a track to get you up in the morning or a kind of still going from the night before kind of energy. Anyway, moving on. The track entitled 1994, which comes next, opens with a sample from George Orwell's 1984 of O'Brien, the character O'Brien, talking to Winston Smith in The Ministry of Love. I assume it is lifted from the film adaptation of 1984, which came out in the year 1984. The year 1994 is somewhat infamous in electronic music, as that is the year the UK government passed the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, which, amongst other things, clamped down on free parties and raves. So one might assume this sample from one of the best known works on the dangers of totalitarianism is a not particularly subtle comment on the overreaching of the government. The track that follows is a pretty brutal industrial onslaught of hammering percussion, ominous churning bass, atonal synths. It feels pretty in keeping with the dystopian vibe of the sample, but the rudimentary production overemphasizes the high end, and it's not massively enjoyable to listen to, feeling more like a test of endurance than something to really get you amped up. There were definitely plenty more producers doing this kind of thing more proficiently back in 1994, that hard acid techno sound. No disrespect to Tom Jenkinson, of course, but it's not a track I would expect to return to all that much. The following track, called O'Brien, so again, another 1984 reference. If you don't know what I'm on about, then just go and look up 1984 by George Orwell, or just read the book. With a bit more polish, this track could almost have fit on Feed Me Weird Things, having that kind of dank late night jazz meets electronics kind of vibe. The 101 makes another appearance with a decent hook, and the breakbeats, although again rudimentary compared to what he'd be doing a few years later, do feel very Squarepusher. The arrangement is a little bit lacking in that there are elements that feel as though they sort of almost are in conflict with one another. The squelchy acid bass line at the bottom of the mix doesn't really complement the higher end 101, and the treatment on some of the drums is pretty harsh, and the track is longer than it needs to be. But it is a highly original style and really just speaks to how much of a talent the young Tom Jenkinson was. Green Width and Falling I'd categorise as oddities, experiments that needed to happen in order to make way for Tom's musical vision to get clarity. Both of them have a very original sound and approach, especially considering this was basically Tom Jenkinson's debut release. Green Width is less appealing to me of the two, with this weird juxtaposition between the soothing pads and snare drum rolls, which again are put through a pretty harsh filter. There's a pulsing acid buzz that comes and goes throughout the track. At points it could be a decently banging 303 line, but it kind of gets the energy sucked out of it by the other elements of the track. Again, the lo-fi production and probably the shoddy version I've been listening to on YouTube do not do it any favours. And I should stress again, none of this should be taken as serious critique. This is purely in the interest of curiosity. So, final reflections. Some releases like this, ultra rarities from an artist's very early days, are little more than historical curiosities. Stereotype is more than that. It is something you would genuinely listen to on its own merits, and a decent chunk of it is genuinely enjoyable, albeit very rough around the edges. But no doubt the new mastering and the fact that an hour of music hasn't been squeezed onto one disc of vinyl will alleviate matters. I haven't actually heard the new version. But given some of the breathtaking music that Squarepusher would go on to create, startlingly original, fastidiously complex, and dazzlingly arranged, Stereotype is among pretty stiff competition. So I'd be pretty far from calling it essential listening as far as his discography goes. Still, from a historical point of view, it is worth checking out, just to hear that familiar Squarepusher touch, but in a very different setting. It's hard to resist a quick Aphex comparison. Richard D. James is often lauded as a boy genius for supposedly composing some of Selected ambient works 85 to 92 while he was still a teenager. That particular myth, I think, has been reliably debunked, and it's safe to say that he was at least 19 before he was laying down any of the material on that album, which puts Tom Jenkinson in a similar place. 5 years later, same age, using whatever equipment he could find and whatever limited space he had to craft his own warped take on electronic music. Saw 85-92 obviously holds up ridiculously well, so that is a pretty harsh comparison, but there are lots of other early Aphex cuts that are very much rawer and rough around the edges, which are quite comparable to some of the content on Stereotype. Anyway, one could debate that until the cows come home. Stereotype is an intriguing listen, and to get the most enjoyment out of it, it is best to approach it on its own terms. Sketches of early experiments that pointed the way to a unique musical vision, but at this point, far from being fully realised. Okay, that is it from me on Stereotype. If you're still watching the video at this point, please give it a like, and please check out my channel for more of the same. Okay, goodbye.